His trash, my ex-husband said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, as if he were commenting on the weather instead of the man sitting beside me. I remember the exact way the crystal glasses caught the light when he said it, how the soft glow from the Christmas tree reflected in them like something warm trying to survive in a room that had suddenly gone cold. No one corrected him. No one even hesitated. My children laughed. Not politely. Not awkwardly. They laughed like it was expected, like this was the role I had always played in their lives, the woman who chose wrong, who settled for less, who embarrassed them simply by existing outside the version of me they preferred. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at Richard. I didn't even look at them. Instead, I adjusted my napkin slowly across my lap, smoothing out a wrinkle that hadn't been there a second ago, as if that small, precise movement could hold the entire moment together. Across from me, Samuel didn't react the way anyone would expect. He didn't defend himself. He didn't shrink. He didn't even glance at me for reassurance. He simply smiled. Not a forced smile, not the kind people use to survive a room full of judgment. It was calm. Measured. Almost knowing. That was the first moment I realized something about this night wasn't unfolding the way Richard thought it was. The dining room looked exactly the way it always had during the holidays, long oak table polished to a mirror shine, white linen runner down the center, candles spaced evenly like someone had measured the distance with care. I had spent 2 days preparing for this dinner. Roasted turkey, honey-glazed carrots, mashed potatoes whipped until they were smooth enough to melt on your tongue. I had followed every tradition I used to believe meant something. The same traditions that once held this family together. Or at least, that's what I used to tell myself. Richard sat at the head of the table, like he still owned the room, like the divorce papers we signed 3 years ago had only been a formality, not a separation. He still carried himself the same way, shoulders back, voice steady, every word placed carefully so it landed exactly where it would do the most damage. He didn't need to raise his voice. He never had. A janitor, Eleanor, he added, swirling his wine as if this were casual conversation. That's what you settled for. I could feel the attention shift, every guest waiting for my reaction, for the moment I would defend myself or explain or apologize for daring to rebuild a life that didn't meet their expectations. But I had learned something over the past few years. Explaining only gives people more room to misunderstand you. So I stayed quiet. My daughter, Claire, leaned back in her chair, her smile sharp in a way that reminded me too much of her father. Mom always had a soft spot for projects, she said, glancing at her brother like they were sharing a private joke. He chuckled under his breath, not even bothering to hide it. I watched them the way you watch strangers in a crowded room, trying to understand how you once knew them so well. There was a time when their laughter meant something different. When it filled a house instead of emptying it. But that felt like someone else's memory now. Someone I used to be. I picked up my fork, steady, deliberate, and took a bite of the turkey I had spent hours preparing. It tasted exactly the way it always had. Familiar. Predictable. Safe. I chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch just enough to make people uncomfortable, though no one would ever admit it. They were too busy pretending everything was normal. That this was normal. Samuel reached for his glass of water, his movements unhurried, his posture relaxed as if he belonged here more than any of them. That smile never left his face. Not once. And for the first time that evening, I let my eyes rest on him, just for a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Long enough for me to understand that whatever was about to happen next, he had already seen it coming. I kept my eyes on my plate, but I could feel the shift in the room, subtle at first, like a draft you only notice when it brushes against your skin. Conversations that had been light and scattered just minutes ago began to tighten, voices lowering, forks pausing midair for a fraction longer than usual. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened, but no one could ignore it either. That was the thing about moments like this. They did not need to be loud to change everything. Richard took another sip of his wine, his expression satisfied in a quiet, controlled way, as if he had just proven a point no one else had dared to say out loud. I had seen that look before. 4 years, I had lived with it, learned to read it, learned to brace myself for whatever came next. But tonight, something felt different. Not in him. In me. I reached for my glass of water, the condensation cool against my fingertips, grounding in a way I had not expected. Across the table, Claire leaned forward, her voice softer now but still carrying that same edge. "So, Samuel," she said, drawing out his name just enough to make it sound unfamiliar, "what exactly do you do?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have, stretched thin by intention. It was not curiosity. It was performance. My son, Daniel, smirked slightly, his gaze flicking between his father and Samuel, waiting for the response like it was part of an unspoken script. Samuel set his glass down carefully before answering, his movements precise, almost deliberate in their simplicity. "I take care of buildings," he said, his voice steady, unhurried. There was no embarrassment in it. No apology. Just a statement. Claire let out a small laugh, quick and dismissive. "That is one way to put it," she replied, glancing at Richard again as if seeking approval. He gave a subtle nod, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. I did not need to look. I already knew. I had spent too many years watching them move like this, passing judgment without ever calling it that. I folded my hands in my lap, listening, observing, letting each word settle into place the way pieces of a puzzle do when you finally stop forcing them. There had been signs long before tonight. Small moments I had dismissed, conversations that felt slightly off but not enough to confront. It was easier, back then, to believe in misunderstandings than in intention. But sitting here now, surrounded by the people I had once called my whole world, I could see it. Clearly. This was not new. This was just the first time it was no longer hidden. Samuel did not react to the laughter. He did not rush to explain himself or correct their assumptions. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged. That same quiet smile remained, not defensive, not strained. It was the kind of smile that made people uneasy without them understanding why. I noticed one of the guests at the far end of the table, a man Richard had invited from his firm, shift uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Samuel, then quickly looked away, as if something about him felt familiar but he could not place it. I caught that moment, held on to it, though I did not yet understand its significance. Richard, however, seemed too focused on maintaining control of the narrative to notice. "Well," he continued, setting his glass down with a soft clink, "I suppose everyone has to start somewhere." His tone was light, almost conversational, but the meaning beneath it was anything but. I could feel Claire's approval in the silence that followed, the way Daniel leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as if this entire exchange had confirmed something they had already decided about me. About us. I looked at Samuel again, this time without hesitation. He met my gaze for a brief second, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. Not reassurance. Not comfort. Understanding. That was when it settled into place, quiet and undeniable. They thought they were defining him. They thought they were defining me. But they had already made their mistake. They were looking at the surface, at the version of the story that was easiest to believe. And they had no idea what they were missing. The rest of the table tried to recover, the way people always do when something uncomfortable lingers too long, by pretending it never mattered in the first place. Plates were passed, someone asked about travel plans, another guest commented on the weather outside as if the snow falling gently beyond the window could somehow soften the tension inside. But it did not. It only made the room feel more contained, like everything was happening under glass. I watched them carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity I had not allowed myself before. For years, I had filled in the gaps for them, softened their words, explained away their silences. I had told myself that love sometimes looked like distance, that respect could be hidden beneath distraction. Sitting there now, I realized how much of that had been something I created on my own. Claire reached for the serving dish of mashed potatoes, her bracelet clinking softly against the porcelain as she scooped a portion onto her plate. She did not look at me when she spoke again. "So, Mom," she said casually, as if we were discussing something ordinary, "how long has this been going on?" Her tone carried that same quiet judgment, wrapped in politeness, designed to sound reasonable while saying something else entirely. I knew what she meant. Not just how long Samuel had been in my life, but how long I had been making choices without their approval. I placed my fork down gently beside my plate, aligning it with the knife the way I had always done, small habits that once made a house feel like home. Long enough, I replied, my voice even, neither defensive nor apologetic. That was all I gave her. No details. No explanations. Just enough to close the door she was trying to open. Daniel exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head slightly. You could have told us, he said, though there was no real interest in being told. It was not about being included. It was about control. It always had been. I let his words settle without responding. Across the table, I noticed the same guest from earlier watching Samuel again, his brow slightly furrowed now, as if a memory was trying to surface but had not fully formed. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, then leaned slightly toward the person next to him, whispering something too quiet to catch. The person he spoke to followed his gaze, their expression changing just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. I was paying attention. Richard, however, was not. He was too busy maintaining the version of the evening he had created, the one where he remained at the center. Directing the tone, shaping how everyone saw what was unfolding. Well, he said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the stem of his glass, I suppose we all make choices we have to live with. His eyes moved to me briefly, then to Samuel, the implication clear without needing to be spoken. I did not react. I did not need to. Because for the first time in a long time, I understood something they did not. This was not a moment I had to survive. It was a moment I could observe. Samuel shifted slightly in his seat, not away from the table, but into it, as if he were settling more comfortably into a space that was already his. That small movement did not go unnoticed. The man at the far end of the table straightened suddenly, his eyes widening just a fraction, recognition finally finding its way through whatever doubt had been holding it back. He did not say anything yet, but the change in him was immediate. Subtle, but undeniable. I felt it before I fully saw it, the way the air in the room adjusted again, not with tension this time, but with something else. Something closer to uncertainty. Claire followed his line of sight, her expression tightening slightly as she tried to understand what had shifted. Daniel frowned, glancing between them, sensing that something was happening outside of his control. Richard, still unaware, lifted his glass once more, preparing to continue as if nothing had changed. But something had. And I could see it clearly now, piece by piece, falling into place in a way that made everything else seem almost irrelevant. I reached for my water again, taking a slow sip, letting the quiet settle around me like a shield. I did not need to interrupt. I did not need to correct anyone. Because whatever they thought they knew about this night, about me, about the man sitting beside me, was already beginning to unravel on its own. It was the smallest detail that changed everything, and if I had not been watching so closely, I might have missed it entirely. The man at the far end of the table, the one who had been quietly observing Samuel for the past several minutes, suddenly set his fork down with a soft but deliberate motion. It was not loud enough to interrupt the conversation, but it carried a weight that shifted the rhythm of the room. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Samuel now with a kind of certainty that had not been there before. I am sorry, he said, his voice careful, almost hesitant. Have we met before? The question was simple, polite even, but it landed differently than everything else that had been said that evening. For the first time since dinner began, the attention at the table moved away from me and settled fully on Samuel. I did not move. I did not look at Richard or at my children. I only watched Samuel, the way his expression did not change, the way that same calm presence remained untouched by the sudden shift in energy around him. He turned his head slightly toward the man, considering the question as if it deserved just enough thought to be respectful, but not enough to suggest uncertainty. That depends, he replied evenly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard without effort, on where you think we might have met. There was no arrogance in his tone. No challenge. Just a quiet statement that somehow made the room feel smaller. The man straightened in his chair, his earlier hesitation replaced by something closer to realization. The Lexington building, he said slowly, as if testing the memory out loud. Downtown. About 2 years ago. A pause followed, not long, but long enough for the name to settle into the space between them. I saw Richard's fingers stop tapping against his glass. Just for a second. Then they resumed, but the rhythm had changed. Samuel nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "That is one of the properties I oversee," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not offer more than what was asked. But it was enough. The word oversee lingered in the air in a way that did not match what had been assumed about him just minutes earlier. Claire frowned slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to reconcile what she was hearing with what she believed. "Wait," she said, leaning forward now, her earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, more uncertain. "You said you take care of buildings." Samuel turned his attention to her without any shift in his composure. "I do," he replied simply. The man at the end of the table let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You do more than that," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if the realization still felt incomplete. "You were at that meeting with the investment group. You were not just taking care of the building. You were the one making the decisions." Silence followed. Not the polite kind. Not the kind people use to transition between topics. This was different. This was the kind of silence that arrives when something has been exposed without anyone intending it. I could feel Claire's posture stiffen beside me, the tension in her shoulders no longer hidden. Daniel shifted in his seat, his earlier ease gone, replaced by a subtle discomfort he could not quite mask. Richard, for the first time that evening, did not speak immediately. He looked at Samuel more closely now, really looking, as if trying to find the version of him he thought he understood and failing to do so. I lowered my gaze to my glass, not because I wanted to avoid the moment, but because I did not need to see their faces to know what was happening. I could hear it in the quiet. I could feel it in the way the room had changed again, this time not with tension or judgment, but with something far more fragile. Doubt. Samuel rested his hands lightly on the edge of the table, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. He did not rush to correct anyone. He did not take advantage of the shift to prove a point. He simply allowed the truth to exist in the space they had created for something else. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. Because it meant that everything they had said, every assumption they had made, had not just been unkind. It had been wrong. I lifted my eyes again, meeting Samuel's gaze for just a brief moment. He did not smile this time. He did not need to. The silence was already doing the work for him. No one reached for their food after that. The plates remained full, the steam rising faintly from dishes that had already begun to cool, as if even the meal itself understood it no longer belonged to the evening. I could feel the shift settle deeper now, not sharp like before, but heavier, more permanent. Claire was the first to break the silence, though her voice had lost the effortless confidence it carried just minutes earlier. "So you manage properties?" she asked, her words careful, each one placed like she was testing the ground beneath her feet. Samuel turned slightly toward her, his expression unchanged, his tone steady. "Among other things," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not fill the silence that followed. He let it sit there, open, unfinished. That was what unsettled them most. People like Richard, like Claire, like Daniel, they depended on filling space with assumptions, with conclusions that made them feel secure in what they believed. Samuel offered them nothing to hold on to. Richard cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound, but it carried a tension that had not been there before. He set his glass down more firmly than necessary, the soft clink echoing slightly against the quiet. "Well," he began, his voice measured, trying to regain control of the moment, "that is quite a way to describe it." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, studying Samuel now with a different kind of focus. Not dismissal. Not quite respect either. Something in between. Something calculating. "You should have been more clear," he added, his tone almost conversational again, but the edge had not disappeared. Samuel met his gaze without hesitation. "You did not ask for clarity," he replied. There was no challenge in his voice, no attempt to correct or embarrass. Just a statement. Simple. Precise. True. I felt something shift inside me at that moment, not because of what he said, but because of what it revealed. For years, I had lived in a space where clarity was never truly wanted, only control. Where questions were not asked to understand, but to confirm what had already been decided. I had played along with it longer than I should have. But I was not playing anymore. Daniel shifted in his seat, running a hand through his hair, his earlier smirk completely gone now. So what exactly do you do then? He asked, more directly this time. Though there was a trace of something else in his voice now. Not curiosity. Not yet. Unease. Samuel glanced at him briefly, then at the table, as if considering how much of an answer was necessary. I work with investment groups, he said. Real estate development, acquisitions, long-term management. He paused just enough for the words to settle before adding, sometimes that includes making sure the buildings run properly. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. I watched as the understanding moved across their faces, not all at once, but in pieces. Claire's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, then stopping herself. Daniel leaned back again, but this time it was not in confidence. It was in retreat. Richard remained still, his expression controlled, but I could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed together just a bit too firmly. He had misjudged the situation. And more than that, he had done it publicly. The man at the end of the table nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if confirming something he already suspected. I thought so, he murmured, not loudly, but enough for those closest to hear. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not. Because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone with a change of subject or a forced laugh. I reached for my napkin again, folding it carefully, aligning the edges with a precision that felt almost automatic. These small, quiet movements had always been my way of maintaining control when everything else felt uncertain. But tonight, it was different. I was not trying to hold anything together. I was simply observing what was already falling apart. Samuel did not say anything else. He did not need to. The truth had already been placed on the table, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore. And for the first time that evening, I saw it clearly in their faces. Not just discomfort. Not just surprise. Regret. Not the kind that comes with understanding. The kind that comes too late. The room did not recover after that, not in the way it usually did when discomfort passed and people found something safe to talk about. This time, the silence stayed, settling into every corner, pressing gently but persistently against everyone at the table. I could see it in the way Claire adjusted her posture, sitting a little straighter now, her earlier ease completely gone. She reached for her glass but did not drink, her fingers lingering around it as if she needed something to hold on to. Daniel avoided looking directly at Samuel, his attention drifting to his plate, then to the candles, then anywhere that did not require him to acknowledge what had just shifted in front of him. Richard remained composed on the surface, but I knew him well enough to recognize the signs. The slight pause before he moved, the way his shoulders held just a bit too still, the careful control in his breathing. He was recalculating. That was always his strength. Not reacting, but adjusting. Finding a way to turn the situation back in his favor, even when the ground beneath him had already changed. Interesting, he said finally, his voice smoother now, more measured, as if the earlier tension had been intentional all along. I suppose titles can be misleading. He lifted his glass again, but this time, he did not drink. He simply held it there, using the motion to reclaim attention. Still, he continued, glancing briefly at Samuel, presentation matters. People make judgments based on what they see. It was subtle, but the implication was clear. He was trying to regain control by reframing the situation, shifting the focus away from his mistake and onto something else. Something safer. Something he could still dominate. Samuel did not respond immediately. He let the words settle, the same way he had done all evening, giving them space to reveal themselves fully before answering. That is true, he said after a moment. People do make judgments. His tone remained calm, but there was something different in it now. Not sharper, not louder, but more defined. The question is whether those judgments are based on what is real, or what is convenient. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that could not be ignored. I felt it ripple through the table, subtle but undeniable. Claire looked down at her plate, her lips pressed together, no longer willing to meet his gaze. Daniel shifted again, exhaling quietly as if trying to release a tension he could not fully name. Even Richard did not respond right away this time. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. The control he relied on was slipping, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that he could feel it. I reached for my fork again, though I did not take a bite. The food had gone cold, but that did not matter. Nothing about this evening had turned out the way I had imagined when I set the table earlier that day. Back then, I thought I was preparing a meal. Now I understood I had been preparing a moment. One I did not fully recognize until I was inside it. Across the table, the man who had recognized Samuel earlier leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with quiet interest, no longer uncertain, no longer hesitant. Others had begun to notice too, though they did not say it out loud. You could see it in the way their attention shifted, in the way they listened more carefully now, measuring each word instead of dismissing it. The balance of the room had changed. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Samuel rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but naturally drew it. He was not trying to prove anything. That was the part they did not understand. He did not need to. Richard set his glass down slowly, the faint sound echoing again in the quiet. "Well," he said, his tone controlled, though there was a trace of something beneath it now, something tighter, less certain. "This has certainly been enlightening." He forced a small smile, the kind that did not reach his eyes. I had seen that smile many times before. It used to unsettle me. Tonight, it did not. Because for the first time, I was not the one being measured against his expectations. I looked at Samuel again, just for a moment, and saw the same calm certainty reflected back at me. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just clarity. And in that clarity, I felt something shift within myself as well. Not anger. Not vindication. Something quieter. Something stronger. The understanding that I had spent too many years trying to fit into a version of myself that no longer existed. And that I did not need their approval to step out of it. No one said anything for a while after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word now carried weight it did not have before. Even the smallest comment could tip the balance further, and for once, they all seemed aware of it. The candles flickered gently in the center of the table, their light reflecting off the polished surface in soft, uneven patterns, as if the room itself was trying to settle into a new shape. I noticed Claire finally take a sip of her drink, though her hand was not as steady as she probably thought it was. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows near his plate, but he did not touch the food. It had become something secondary now, almost irrelevant. This was no longer a dinner. It was something else entirely. Richard shifted in his chair, a subtle movement, but one that carried intention. He was not finished. He never was. "Well," he said, his voice returning to that familiar controlled calm, though it sounded more deliberate now, as if he were choosing each word with greater care. "I suppose we all underestimated the situation." He gave a small, measured smile, glancing briefly around the table, acknowledging the shift without admitting fault. That was always his way. Adjust, but never concede. I watched him closely, not with resentment, but with a kind of distance I had not felt before. For years, I had tried to understand him, to anticipate his reactions, to soften his edges before they could cut too deeply. Tonight, I realized I did not need to do that anymore. Samuel did not respond to Richard immediately. Instead, he reached for his glass, taking a slow sip of water, his movements unhurried, grounded in a way that seemed to anchor the entire moment. When he set the glass down, the sound was soft, but it carried through the silence. "There is nothing to underestimate," he said quietly. "Only things that are seen clearly, and things that are not." His tone was not confrontational. It did not need to be. The words themselves were enough. Claire looked up at that, her expression shifting again, something sharper now, something closer to self-awareness, though she did not fully let it surface. "So you just Let people think whatever they want, she asked, her voice softer, less certain than before. Samuel turned his attention to her, his expression unchanged, but his presence steady, attentive. People usually do, he replied. It saves them time. There was no accusation in his voice, no attempt to make her feel small. But the truth in it lingered, quiet and undeniable. I saw the way she processed it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way she looked down again, not out of defiance this time, but out of something closer to reflection. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture I had seen since he was a child whenever he felt out of place. It struck me then, not with sadness, but with clarity, how little had changed in some ways, and how much had changed in others. Richard, however, did not retreat. He leaned forward slightly now, his hands resting on the table, his posture controlled, but more engaged. Still, he said, his voice quieter, more focused, it is an unusual approach. Most people prefer to be understood. Samuel met his gaze without hesitation. Most people prefer to be comfortable, he replied. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching across the table in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The man at the far end nodded faintly again, as if confirming something for himself, while the others remained still, caught somewhere between reacting and remaining silent. I felt a shift within myself as well, not because of what was being said, but because of what I no longer felt the need to do. I did not need to defend Samuel. I did not need to explain my choices. I did not need to bridge the gap between their expectations and my reality. That space no longer belonged to me. I folded my hands together on the table, resting them lightly against the edge, my posture relaxed in a way it had not been earlier that evening. For the first time. Since I walked into that room, I was not bracing for impact. I was simply present. Samuel glanced at me briefly, just for a second, and in that moment, there was an understanding that did not require words. Not reassurance. Not protection. Partnership. It was quiet, almost invisible to anyone else, but it was there. And it was enough. Around us, the room continued to adjust, the balance still shifting, still settling into something new. Not everyone would understand it. Not everyone would accept it. But that no longer felt like something I needed to change. Because the version of me they had been responding to all these years was no longer the one sitting at that table. And for the first time, they were beginning to realize it. The room did not return to what it had been, but it did not remain frozen either. It shifted into something quieter, more careful, like everyone had suddenly become aware that every word carried consequences they could no longer predict. I noticed Claire glance at me again, this time not with judgment, not even with confusion, but with something more fragile. Uncertainty. It was unfamiliar on her face. For years, she had spoken to me with a kind of certainty that came from believing she understood everything about me, about my choices, about my limitations. That certainty was gone now, replaced by something she did not quite know how to hold. "Mom," she said after a moment, her voice softer than it had been all evening, "you never mentioned any of this." The way she said it was different too. Not accusing. Not dismissive. Just searching. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a brief second, I saw the child she used to be, the one who used to sit beside me at this same table, asking questions without judgment, without assumption. It passed quickly, replaced again by the adult she had become. "You never asked," I said simply. There was no edge in my voice. No bitterness. Just the truth. She did not respond right away. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something more, but the words did not come. Daniel shifted beside her, his posture less rigid now, though not entirely at ease. "We just thought," he began, then stopped, the sentence trailing off as he realized he did not know how to finish it without exposing more than he intended. I did not help him. I let the silence remain. Because sometimes what is left unsaid reveals more than anything spoken out loud. Richard watched this exchange closely, his expression controlled, but I could see the calculation behind it. He was trying to understand the new balance, trying to find where he still held influence and where it had slipped away. It was subtle, but it was there. "Assumptions can be dangerous," he said, his tone measured, as if he were offering a general observation rather than acknowledging what had just happened. It was his way of staying above the moment, of not stepping fully into it. Samuel did not respond to that. He did not need to. The conversation had already moved beyond him in a way that made his silence more powerful than any reply. I noticed the other guests at the table now watching not just Samuel, but me. That was new. Earlier, I had been part of the background, a quiet presence defined by how others described me. Now, their attention shifted in a way that felt different. Not curiosity alone. Reconsideration. I reached for my glass again, taking a slow sip, letting the coolness settle. I was aware of every movement, not because I was trying to control the moment, but because I no longer felt the need to rush through it. Claire finally exhaled, her shoulders lowering slightly. "I guess we did not realize," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. Daniel nodded faintly, though he did not add anything. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first step toward something they had never offered before. Recognition. I did not respond immediately. I let their words sit, not to make them uncomfortable, but to give them the weight they deserved. 4 years, I had filled these spaces too quickly, smoothing over tension before it could fully surface. Tonight, I allowed it to remain. "It is easy to see what you expect to see," I said after a moment, my voice steady, calm. "It is harder to look again when something does not fit." Neither of them argued with that. They could not. Because they were already doing it, right there, in front of me. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting between me and Samuel, his expression unreadable now. He was no longer directing the conversation. He was part of it. That alone marked a change I had never thought I would witness so clearly. The candles burned lower, their light softer now, casting longer shadows across the table. The room felt different, not tense in the way it had been earlier, but not comfortable either. It was something in between. Something honest. Samuel rested his hand lightly near mine on the table, not touching, not drawing attention, but close enough that I could feel the presence of it. It was not a gesture meant for anyone else to see. It did not need to be. I did not look at him this time. I did not need to. Because for the first time in a long time, I was not navigating this space alone. And that, more than anything else that had happened that evening, was the quietest and most undeniable shift of all. The conversation did not pick back up in the way it normally would after something difficult had been acknowledged. There was no easy transition, no one stepping in to redirect the moment toward something lighter. Instead, the quiet remained, but it had changed again. It was no longer heavy or uncertain. It felt settled. Like something that had been waiting for a long time had finally found its place. I looked around the table, taking in each face one more time, not searching for reactions, not measuring expressions, just seeing them clearly for what they were. Claire sat with her hands folded now, her earlier tension replaced by something quieter, more inward. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze no longer avoiding mine, but not fully meeting it either. Richard remained composed, but there was a stillness to him that had not been there before, as if he had reached the edge of something he could not control and was deciding not to push further. I rested my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding, familiar, but no longer something I needed to hold on to. For years, I had believed that moments like this defined relationships, that what was said, what was done, determined what could be repaired and what could not. But sitting here now, I understood something different. It was not this moment that mattered most. It was everything that had led to it, and everything that would follow after. I reached for my napkin and folded it carefully, placing it beside my plate with the same quiet precision I had carried throughout the evening. Not out of habit this time, but out of intention. A small, deliberate act that marked something finished. Samuel remained beside me, his presence steady, unchanged, not asking for anything, not needing to. That had been the difference all along. He did not require the room to adjust to him. He simply existed within it, fully, without apology. And in doing so, he had allowed me to do the same. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but naturally, as if the evening had reached its end exactly when it was supposed to. The movement drew their eyes, one by one, but no one spoke immediately. They were waiting, perhaps for an explanation, perhaps for something that would make the moment easier to understand. I did not give it to them. I looked at Claire first, then Daniel, holding their gaze just long enough to acknowledge them, not as they had been, not as I had once needed them to be, but as they were now. Dinner was lovely, I said, my voice calm, even, carrying no trace of what had passed between us earlier. It was not dismissal. It was closure. Claire opened her mouth slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but stopped. Daniel shifted in his chair again, his expression uncertain, but he did not speak either. Richard gave a small nod, his composure intact, but his silence heavier now, more deliberate. I did not wait for more. I did not need it. I turned slightly toward Samuel, and without a word, he stood as well, his movement as calm and measured as it had been all evening. For a brief second, the room felt suspended, as if everyone understood that something had ended, even if they could not yet define what it was. Samuel reached for my coat, draping it gently over my shoulders, the gesture simple, unspoken, but complete in its meaning. I slipped my arms into it, the warmth settling around me, familiar, steady. As we moved toward the door, I did not look back immediately. Not because I was avoiding anything, but because I did not need to. The weight I had carried into that room was no longer mine to hold. At the doorway, I paused just for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the frame, and I allowed myself one final glance. Not to seek reaction. Not to measure change. Just to see. They were still there, still processing, still adjusting to something they had not expected. But that was theirs now. Not mine. I gave a small nod, more to myself than to anyone else, then stepped out into the quiet night air. The cold was sharp, but clean, the kind that clears your thoughts instead of clouding them. Beside me, Samuel walked at an easy pace, neither ahead nor behind, simply with me. I took a slow breath, feeling something settle deep within me, something steady, something certain. I did not need to explain what they had missed. I did not need to correct what they had misunderstood. Because for the first time in a long time, I understood something clearly. They had not lost me tonight. They had simply realized they never truly knew me at all.